Welcome to Darkened Dreams. As we dive into tonight's unsettling tale, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I've lived in this neighborhood my entire life. It's a quiet suburban area where everyone knows each other, where kids play in the streets, and where the most exciting thing that usually happens is the annual block party. So when the old Jenkins house at the end of the street finally sold after being on the market for years, it was a big deal. The Jenkins house had always been a bit of an oddity. It was one of the oldest houses on the block, a large, creaky Victorian that seemed out of place among the modern bungalows and split levels. The Jenkins family had lived there for decades, but after Mr. Jenkins passed away, his wife moved into a nursing home, and the house had been empty ever since. That is, until the new neighbor moved in. It was a Saturday morning when I first saw him. I was out for a jog, something I did every morning, and as I passed by the Jenkins house, I noticed a moving truck parked in the driveway. A tall, thin man was standing on the porch watching the movers unload boxes and furniture. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd expect to see in a black and white movie, and he had this peculiar, almost unsettling smile on his face. I gave him a friendly wave as I jogged by, but he didn't wave back. He just kept smiling, staring at me as I passed. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just one of those people who took a while to warm up to new neighbors. I figured I'd introduce myself properly once he was settled in. But as the days went by, I began to notice strange things about him. For one, he never seemed to leave the house. I work from home, so I'm around most of the day, and I never saw him coming or going. His car was always parked in the same spot in the driveway, and the blinds on the windows were always drawn. The house, which had once been dark and empty, now seemed almost too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. And then there were the lights. Every night around the same time, I would see lights flickering in the windows of the Jenkins house. Not the steady glow of a lamp or the flicker of a TV, but a strange, erratic light that seemed to move from room to room. It was almost as if someone was walking through the house with a candle, but that didn't make sense in this day and age. I mentioned it to my wife, but she just laughed it off, saying I was overthinking things. "He's probably just adjusting to a new home," she said. "Give him some time." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I was sitting in my living room staring at the Jenkins house through the window when I saw the lights flicker on again. I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed a flashlight, threw on a jacket, and told my wife I was going for a walk. As I approached the house, I felt a strange sense of unease. The air seemed colder around the Jenkins house, and the closer I got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. I crept up to the front yard, staying in the shadows, and peered through one of the windows. What I saw made my blood run cold. The living room was filled with boxes, unpacked, untouched, exactly where the movers had left them. But that wasn't what frightened me. It was the man, the new neighbor. He was standing in the center of the room, his back to me, holding a candle in his hand. The flickering light cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, but he didn't move. He just stood there perfectly still, as if he was listening for something. I watched him for what felt like an eternity, unable to tear my eyes away. And then, slowly, he began to turn his head. I ducked down, pressing myself against the side of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few moments, I dared to peek through the window again, but the living room was empty. He was gone. I didn't wait to see where he went. I bolted back to my house, slamming the door behind me. My wife looked up from the couch, startled. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd seen. I just told her I wasn't feeling well and went to bed, hoping sleep would erase the image from my mind. But it didn't. The next day, I tried to act normal, but the events of the previous night weighed heavily on me. I couldn't concentrate on work, and every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see that strange man standing in his yard watching me. But the house remained quiet, the blinds still drawn. That evening, as I was taking out the trash, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. In the garbage bin at the end of my driveway, there was an old dusty box. It looked out of place, like it had been there for years, but I knew it hadn't been there the day before. I cautiously lifted the lid and peered inside. It was filled with old photographs, black and white images of the neighborhood, of houses that looked much younger, of people in old-fashioned clothes. And in every photo, there was the man from the Jenkins house, always in the background, always watching. I dropped the box, my hands shaking, and backed away. I ran inside and locked the door, my mind racing. Who was this man? How long had he been here? And why hadn't anyone noticed? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling into fear and paranoia. And then, around midnight, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping at the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping continued, steady and insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. I wanted to get up, to look, but I was paralyzed with fear. I knew who it was. I didn't need to look. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning I found the courage to look out the window, but there was nothing there, no sign that anyone had been outside. I tried to talk to my wife about it, but she just brushed it off as stress. I even considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? That my new neighbor was too quiet, that he made me feel uneasy. They'd think I was crazy. But I know what I saw. I know that man is something different, something wrong. And I'm terrified because I think he knows that I know. I've started keeping the blinds closed, and I avoid looking out the window at night. But I can still feel him watching me, waiting, and I'm scared because I don't know what he's waiting for. I moved into my new apartment about 6 months ago. It was a nice place, a bit on the older side, but well maintained with a cozy feel. It was the kind of building where you could hear your neighbors through the walls, but everyone was friendly enough. The only weird thing was my next-door neighbor, Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison was an older man, probably in his late 60s, and he kept to himself. He wasn't rude or anything. He just never seemed interested in talking. I'd see him occasionally in the hallway or at the mailboxes, but he'd always just nod and move on. His apartment was right next to mine, and sometimes I'd hear strange noises coming from his place. Soft thumps, scraping sounds, and sometimes what sounded like a faint humming. I chalked it up to him being a bit eccentric, and thought nothing more of it. But then I started noticing the light. It was around the 3rd month of living there when I first noticed it. There was a small window in my living room that faced out to a narrow alleyway between my building and the one next door. At night, I'd sometimes catch a glimpse of a light coming from Mr. Harrison's basement window. It wasn't a steady light, more like a faint flicker, almost as if a candle or an old lamp was being moved around. At first, I figured he was just down there doing whatever old men do, maybe tinkering with something or looking for some forgotten item, but the more I noticed the light, the stranger it seemed. It was always at odd hours, sometimes as late as 2 or 3 in the morning, and it wasn't just the light. Sometimes I'd hear a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the basement. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night it carried. One night I couldn't sleep. I was tossing and turning, my mind racing with thoughts from work and life, when I noticed the light again. This time it seemed more erratic, moving faster than usual. The tapping was louder too, almost like a hammer hitting something hard. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check it out. I threw on a jacket and slipped out of my apartment, heading down the hallway to the basement stairs. The building was quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. I hesitated for a moment at the top of the stairs, then slowly made my way down, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. When I reached the bottom, I saw the door to the basement storage area. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light seeped through the crack. I could hear the tapping more clearly now, steady and rhythmic. My heart was pounding, but I pushed the door open slowly. The hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The basement was cold and musty, filled with old furniture, boxes, and other forgotten items. And there, in the far corner, was Mr. Harrison, standing over a large workbench. He didn't see me at first. He was too focused on whatever he was doing. I watched as he picked up a small hammer and began tapping something on the bench, a small flat piece of metal. His movements were precise, almost mechanical. I cleared my throat, trying to get his attention without startling him. "Mr. Harrison," I called softly. He jumped, dropping the hammer with a loud clang. He turned to face me, his eyes wide and wild. For a moment he just stared at me, his face pale and drawn. "What are you doing down here?" he finally asked, his voice shaky. I saw the light," I stammered. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just working on something," he said, his voice still trembling. "Old habits, you know." I glanced past him at the workbench. There were dozens of small metal objects scattered across it, pieces of jewelry, old coins, small tools. But there was something else there, something that made my blood run cold. A small, tattered doll, lying face down on the bench, its hair matted and dirty. "Is that—" I began, but he cut me off. "Just something I found," he said quickly, his voice suddenly calm. "It's nothing. You should go back upstairs. It's late." I nodded, backing away slowly. I didn't need to be told twice. As I turned to leave, I couldn't help but notice the way he watched me, his eyes narrow and calculating. I hurried back up the stairs, my heart racing, and locked my apartment door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept thinking about that doll, about the way he'd been tapping away in the basement at such a late hour. And then there were the other sounds I'd heard over the past few months, the scraping, the humming. It all seemed to click into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid Mr. Harrison as much as possible. I'd take a different route to my car, avoid the hallways where I might run into him. But the noises didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. And the light, oh, the light. It was there every night now, flickering in the darkness like a beacon calling me back. Then, one night, I woke up to a new sound, a soft, scratching noise, like something being dragged across the floor. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The noise was coming from my living room, from the window that faced the alley. I got up slowly and crept towards the window, my heart hammering in my chest. As I peered through the curtains, I saw it, the doll standing upright on the windowsill, its matted hair blowing slightly in the breeze. Its eyes, dark and lifeless, seemed to stare directly at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair, my breath catching in my throat. I had seen that doll before, on Mr. Harrison's workbench. I don't remember how long I stood there staring at the thing, but eventually I found the courage to approach the window again. I reached out with a shaking hand, grabbed the doll, and threw it as hard as I could into the alley. I slammed the window shut and locked it, backing away slowly, my eyes never leaving the spot where the doll had been. The next morning, I went down to the alley to see if the doll was still there, but it was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of it, no sign of anything. I decided then and there that I needed to move. Whatever was going on with Mr. Harrison, I didn't want to be around to find out. I've been living with my sister for the past few weeks while I search for a new place. I haven't been back to the apartment since. I don't know what Mr. Harrison was doing in that basement or why he had that doll, but I do know one thing. I don't want to find out. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that faint tapping in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat. I haven't told anyone else about it. I don't think they'd believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw. And I know I never want to see that doll again. My wife and I have lived in our quaint little neighborhood for over a decade. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other's name, where you can leave your doors unlocked without a second thought. We raised our 2 kids here, made lifelong friends, and found a sense of peace in this small slice of suburbia. But that all changed when the new family moved in next door. It was early spring when they arrived. The house next to ours had been empty for months, ever since the Thompsons moved to Florida to be closer to their grandchildren. The new family, a couple with a teenage daughter, moved in quietly. There wasn't much fanfare, just a few movers unloading furniture into the old Thompson place one afternoon. My wife, being the friendly type, baked a batch of cookies and insisted we go over to introduce ourselves. The couple introduced themselves as the Larsons. They were polite enough, but something about them felt off. The wife, Mary, had a nervous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and the husband, Paul, seemed distracted, constantly glancing around like he was looking for something. Their daughter, Emily, was a quiet, sullen-looking teenager who didn't say much beyond a soft hello. When we handed them the cookies, Mary thanked us, but it almost seemed like she didn't know what to do with them, like she hadn't been expecting any kindness from anyone. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't help but notice strange things about the Larsons. For one, they never seemed to leave the house. The driveway was always empty, no cars coming or going. They didn't go for walks or sit on their porch like the rest of us. Their blinds were always drawn, day and night. It was like they were hiding from something or someone. And then there were the noises. At night, I would sometimes hear muffled sounds coming from their house. It was hard to make out what it was. Sometimes it sounded like someone crying, other times like soft whispers or low murmuring. My wife thought I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air whenever I passed by their house, a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. One night, things took a turn for the worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of a loud thud coming from the Larsons' house. It was so loud that it made our windows rattle. I got up and peered through the blinds, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. I considered going back to bed, but something stopped me. Instead, I found myself heading downstairs and out the back door, creeping through our yard toward the Larsons' place. As I got closer, I could see a faint light flickering from one of their upstairs windows. The blinds were still drawn, but there was a small gap where the light seeped through. I moved quietly, trying not to make a sound, and positioned myself beneath the window. That's when I heard it. Soft, muffled sobbing, like someone was trying to cry without being heard. It was Emily. I recognized her voice. I wanted to call out to her to see if she was okay, but something held me back. I stayed there, listening, feeling like a voyeur in my own neighborhood. After a few moments, the sobbing stopped and I heard footsteps approaching the window. I ducked down, holding my breath. The light went out, and everything was silent again. I hurried back to my house, heart pounding. I didn't tell my wife what I'd heard. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. The next day, I kept a close eye on the Larson house, but everything seemed normal, at least as normal as it ever was with them. The blinds stayed shut, and there was no sign of movement. A few days later, things got even stranger. My son, Ben, came home from school looking pale and shaken. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me he'd seen Emily in the park near our house. He'd tried to say hello, but she just stared at him like she didn't recognize him. Then she whispered something that didn't make any sense. She said, "They don't want us here," Ben told me, his voice trembling. "They don't want us to leave." I didn't know what to make of it. I tried to convince myself that Ben had just misheard her, or that Emily was just being a strange teenager. But deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. That night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I waited until my wife was asleep, then grabbed a flashlight and headed back to the Larsons' house. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I needed answers. I crept around the side of their house, keeping to the shadows. I tried the back door, but it was locked. Then I noticed the basement window. It was slightly open, just enough for me to pry it the rest of the way. I hesitated for a moment, then climbed inside. The basement was dark and cold, the air thick with dust. I switched on my flashlight and swept it across the room. It was mostly empty, just a few old boxes and some broken furniture. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Chains. There were chains bolted to the wall with manacles hanging from the ends, and a small mattress on the floor, dirty and stained. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard a noise behind me, a soft shuffling sound. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and there was Emily, standing at the top of the basement stairs, her eyes wide and terrified. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to help us. They're not my parents." Before I could respond, a hand grabbed me from behind. I felt a sharp pain at the back of my head, and everything went black. I woke up in my own bed, my wife sitting beside me, her face pale with worry. She told me I'd been found in the park, unconscious, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. I tried to tell her about Emily, about what I'd seen in the basement, but she just looked at me like I was crazy. When I insisted on calling the police, she agreed, but when they went to check the Larsons' house, it was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, no chains, nothing. It was as if they had never been there. I haven't seen the Larsons since. The house next door has been empty for months now, and sometimes late at night I see a faint light flickering in one of the upstairs windows. I don't know what happened to Emily, or who, or what the Larsons really were, but I know one thing: I will never forget the fear in her eyes, and I'll never feel safe in this neighborhood again.